Professor Advani, you are
Yeah,
like a guru to all of us. You are a pioneer in the field of medical oncology and you have 45 years of experience. It is a great honor for me to interview you. Good morning, sir.
good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, in 1974, after your MD, I learned that you secured your first job in Tata Memorial Hospital in medical oncology. So, what was the attitude towards the treatment of lung cancers in 1974?
Yeah, when I joined Tata Memorial Hospital, uh, attention in medical oncology to the solid tumors in general was very poor. And surgeons used to say, what you can do in solid tumors? You better limit yourself to only the blood related diseases and not the solid tumors. Why? Because they were using in those days only tablets, endoxon, methotrexate, and maybe little 5-FU. These are the 3-4 drugs which are available. Even that time, vincristine has just come in, and therefore they did not have any access to any of these drugs. And therefore, the attitude was don't do anything for the solid tumors, including the lung cancer. So I think at that time it was really the support care, and even support care was very, very, very preliminary. The only support care was go home and live a life over there. That was the support care in 1974.
Sir, in the 1970s and 80s, the prognosis was considered to be poorer for advanced non small cell lung cancer as compared to small cell lung cancer. I believe that was the perception at that time. What can you tell us about the perception towards non small cell lung cancer versus small cell lung cancer in 70s and 80s?
I think even for the small cell carcinoma, usually these are the patients who used to come with the advanced disease all over the body, metastatic disease. And then they used to respond maybe with some injection in Doxon or methotrexate. They used to respond for a very short period of time, and then they, they will progress. So overall, whether it's a small cell or non-small cell, it was sort of a borderline difference. And I must also say that that time the pathology was poor, and therefore it was very hard to sort of believe that is a small cell versus non-small cell. The only thing which we were satisfied was that it's a lung cancer.
So, you already mentioned about very few drugs available at that time. What were the drugs available for the treatment of non-small cell lung cancer in 1980s? And we learned that only few agents were available, and at best they produce a response rate of in a single agent 15%. Combination chemotherapy showed a response rate of less than 20%. What would you do to treat these patients in the 1980s?
I think it was very clear those days that we used to use endoxon, maybe methotrexate, 5-FU, play around with that, and the response rate was negligible. The first time when we were really excited, and that was the excitement not only with us, but all over the world, was the introduction of cisplatin. That made a big difference as a single agent as well as in combination of these. So the commonest protocol was cisplatin with cyclophosphamide. These two drugs were used, and we used to say fantastic response. And that was the thing that we started. So I think the improvement in the uh, lung cancer really started with the introduction of cisplatin, which made a big impact in the overall outcome also, and also the response rate. So I think that was the first thing to happen. And after that, I mean, you and I know that how every 10 years we have improved our results with new and new introduction.
Sir, I read a paper from Dr. P.J. Saukat from the Lyon Hospital, French group, in Lancet 1993, that showed that the advanced non-small cell lung cancer, whatever they could do, even with radiation and best supportive care, the median survival was only 16 to 17 weeks, and 1 year survival was anything less than 15%. So, what were your thoughts at that time, sir?
I think we were so happy to relieve the patient at least of the immediate trouble. That was the biggest thing. That the patient comes in, takes the treatment, and he comes and tells you, "Well, I'm feeling better." So that was a big joy for us because that made us realize that we should not send our patient back without treatment. And that's a period, when we had few drugs coming up. First was cisplatin, which makes so cisplatin based therapy became a standard in those days, and that really had a huge impact. And after that came the other drugs, like it came the etoposide, then came the uh, paclitaxel, then came gemcitabine. So it took almost 10 years of each new drug to come. It did not come very easily. So first was cisplatin. 10 years later, we had the gemcitabine, paclitaxel, and then the etoposide and other drugs.
Absolutely. Sir, in 1995, in the space of advanced non-small cell lung cancer, a meaningful work, a meta-analysis from 52 randomized trials was published in the BMJ, which showed that for the first time, cisplatin-based chemotherapy was superior to best supportive care. At that time, how did the medical oncology community accept that data?
Oh, it was dramatic. We did not need any statistics to say to use this. We could see the difference. And if you use in 10 patients, you know that this is working. And therefore, it was accepted very easily. The problem in those days was only the cost. The cisplatin 10 milligram dose used to cost in those days 200 rupees. So very few of our patients used to afford that. And so that was the situation. So it was that everybody knew that this is a good drug. Even surgeon also knew there's a good drug. They also knew that cisplatin cannot be used by them. It has to be given by the medical oncologist. And therefore it was accepted very easily. Of course, I must say that there were a few problems with it. First problem was that in those days we did not have good antiemetic therapy. We never had a good antiemetic therapy in those days. So our whole emphasis in giving the cisplatin were two. One is to prevent the renal toxicity. That was very important because everybody knew that it's toxic to the kidney. And second, nausea and vomiting was a major problem. And therefore, I do not know how you will react to this, but I remember we used to give high dose dexamethasone, high dose Perinom or Domstal, high dose 40 milligram. The patient used to get all sorts of extrapyramidal symptoms with that dose. And continue this for at least 2 3 days because next day and third day the patient will still going to vomit and will get dehydrated and will have the kidney problem. So I think there were multiple problems, but we knew it's working, and we knew that we have to do all these things. But there was a limitation, and therefore everybody could not accept it. I remember a few patients who took the cisplatin, and next time they used to come up to the door of the hospital and run back. That was their whole attitude. They used to literally run back, and people, relatives, have to hold them and bring it to the hospital inside. So that was a problem. And also, of course, the kidney toxicity was really solved by giving adequate hydration. Adequate hydration took care of that.
It is fascinating to hear the story of cisplatin, cost, toxicity, and how you all, taught us how to handle the drug cisplatin, and I mean that has kind of revolutionized the care not only in non-small cell lung cancer probably for several other malignancies. If I'm not wrong, that was the contemporary time for the germ cell tumors also. That's when cisplatin became a
Absolutely.
very
Yes.
important drug. In the early 2000s, the ECOG 1594 data was published, which showed that 4 different platinum doublets, when platinum was combined with either taxanes, docetaxel, or paclitaxel and gemcitabine, showed somewhat similar efficacy and similar 1 year survival of around 35%. So that doublet, and was that a practice changing data, sir, at that time?
Yeah, I think it had a major impact because before that, everybody from different institute used to claim that this is better. Best is paclitaxel cisplatin, or best is gemcitabine and cisplatin, or the third one will say etoposide and cisplatin, the best one, and good results. But when this data came in, everybody realized that everybody is in the same boat, and therefore there's nothing superior, nothing inferior. I think this is what was a mind opening, that all of us realized, everybody realized that we are achieving the same results with different doublets. So there's no point changing just because you hear some talk somewhere that you have to change your doublets. That was really went out. So it was a very good study which clearly showed that all the things are similar.
Maybe you could also look at the individual patient profile, their pre-existing comorbidities and anticipated toxicities, and that gave you choices at that time. Sir, in 2008, Dr. Parvish Parikh and Dr. Scagliati published an important paper in the JCO, which established the role of pemetrexed in non-squamous non-small cell lung cancer. Suddenly, pathology and adequacy of the tissue became important. What were your thoughts at that time?
Well, I think that was really very remarkable in the sense that before that, all of us were sort of not bothered about whether it's a squamous cell or whether it's an adenocarcinoma, and also our pathologists were also most of the time they'll write non-small cell lung cancer, and nobody used to force them to give us more uh, diagnosis in detail. And it's only with this realization that everybody, all pathologists, started talking about it. That how to recognize adeno, how to recognize squamous, although I'm sure they knew about it. But still, that ability on a small tissue to give the diagnosis was a challenge for them. Particularly in those days, there was no core biopsy. It was all FNACs. And on FNAC, sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between these two things. And therefore, we started forcing the pathologists to really give us the exact diagnosis because we knew that the treatment is different. And it took us a lot of time. And ultimately, everybody realized that's important. So it becomes mutually beneficial. So I think that was the stage when we started talking about the subclassification of non-small cell carcinoma of the lung. Otherwise, normally it used to be, I still sort of remember that it used to be all squamous cell carcinoma. Adenocarcinoma in those days was rare. In India, there are published papers. They say adenocarcinoma is small percentage. And today you can see the change, that how adenocarcinoma is more prominent. I think it was more of the recognition that on FNAC it was difficult. On pathologists also realized that maybe that we don't need that differentiation, and therefore it was say very simple for them to write non-small cell lung cancer, and that's how we used to accept that and start the treatment. But once we knew that we want the exact diagnosis, I think things improved.
The tissue became important, and that has also later on led to several revolutions in the molecular biology, so on and so forth. Sir, in 2009, maintenance therapy with pemetrexed and switch maintenance with docetaxel became popular. That's when these studies appeared. So the concept established itself. How did you adopt maintenance therapy in advanced non-small cell lung cancer, what were the challenges when you counsel patients that you have to be on a prolonged maintenance therapy, and how did you execute that?
I think the whole concept about maintenance treatment was absent in all the solid tumors. Everybody used to believe maintenance treatment is of no value. And there are some people who used to say continue treatment till the lifetime, continue it. A lifetime today, it does not mean anything. Lifetime means when the patient gets resistant, you change. While that time, there was no change. And therefore, people used to think that this will go on for lifetime and that will be the end of it. So that also transformation did occur. But I must say that it's only because of the amitrexate that people recognized to use it to continue to maintain the response. So I think this was the thing which really changed what we were doing it before. Very simple. That we used to give one course of chemotherapy, say 4 courses or 6 courses, and then you find, oh, still the residual disease is there. So fine, change the next line of treatment. Go to the gemcitabine and cisplatin, then find some response again, but disease is still there because it never used to go away. And therefore, change to the third line if the patient is still strong and is still able to pay, and then go to the fourth line also. So that was the concept. It was not realized that even if we are able to get the response and maintain it, that will be superior. So I think the important thing is not the maintenance treatment like we do it in the leukemia, where the patient is in remission. While here, the patient has a visible disease, and then also you are using the maintenance treatment. I think that difference, even today, some people don't realize that it's a maintenance treatment in the presence of the partial response. It's not a disease has gone and you are giving maintenance treatment to maintain. It's not that way. So this concept of maintaining partial response was the first time we realized after the introduction of the pemetrexed.
Great words, sir. You have told us that in at that time, even as a concept, appreciating partial response and even stable disease, and appreciating that in solid tumors was not there. And then, now we easily adopt that, and resist criterias have come in to tell us. And particularly with the advent of the modern therapies, we know that progression itself is defined in many ways, but this concept of appreciating partial response and stable disease, that's a great, fascinating thing to hear from you. So around the same time, in 2000, late 2000 and 2009 and 10, the ECOG 4599 and the AVILE study came to our attention, and that established the role of bevacizumab in non-small cell lung cancer. How did you see the arrival of VEGF inhibitors in non-small cell lung cancer?
Yeah, I think these biological factors did come in. But I must admit that we never saw a phenomenal response with them. And we knew that this is not going to make a major impact in terms of controlling the disease. So it was not really, one was a cost factor, and second was the response factor. There was not much difference whether you add the all this bevacizumab and all in such a situation. Therefore, there was not really major impact that I could see in those days when this thing came in. We were still waiting for something more where we can see visibly the difference.
So the targeted therapies for non-small cell lung cancer appeared in early 2000. The early phase 1, phase 2 data in 2002, 2003, and some of those photographs when we see, we were so excited. And they showed to improve some survival with gefitinib and erlotinib. And the IPA study was published in 2009, which showed that gefitinib is superior to chemotherapy in EGFR mutated patients in first line. So in the 2000s, what were your foresight, and what did you see for targeted therapies as a new option emerging in non-small cell lung cancer?
I think it was miraculous. It was really miraculous. But we could see with our own eyes that patient is receiving no chemotherapy, and with a tablet, the disease can disappear. That was really phenomenal, and I think we really accepted it very quickly. And of course, it was few patients, but even few patients with complete response make a major impact in your brain. You cannot just believe it that it has happened, that X-ray has become normal. That's really, I used to tell my students and colleagues over there, look, X-ray has become clear from here to there. And it used to be really, everybody used to look at that patient, how is he feeling. So I think it's a phenomenon that one sort of a step made the major impact in all of us. And this was a result better than what we sort of got it when the cisplatin came in. That was also a major thing, but this was beyond that.
Sir, in 2009, AFCO had a presidential address on personalizing cancer care. And suddenly, molecular testing became inevitable. There was a New England Journal publication from Dr. Sandler about the EGFR mutations, and all these mutations were understood. And subsequently, we know that first generation, second generation, third generation drugs arrived for each different mutations. But in 2009, what did you see as a landscape for precision medicine, personalizing medicine in non-small cell lung cancer?
I think actually it became clear to us long before. And we used to be involved in our department with a lot of basic work. Luckily we had that time along with us Cancer Research Institute. There were many PhDs who were doing a lot of molecular work, but those technology was slow. So we used to share our ideas with them. The first time I remember it was in chronic myeloid leukemia that we realized that we could really see the Philadelphia chromosome by FISH technology and the other normal cytogenetics. So it has come at that time. But then in the lung cancer, it came after this introduction. And I think it was also obvious that there will be many more pathways which will be affected. Because these were all interesting things those days. Theoretical also, that there are so many pathways, there are so many targets which are opening up now. And more new drugs will come because we know now targets. So in those days, when I used to start the lecture, I used to say that olden days of drug discovery by serendipity that just came in is over. Now we have the mind-made uh, drugs which will recognize the target and develop them. So I think that was a difference, overnight difference, that how we started making the drugs based on what we need. And in contrast to previously, when they used to come by chance. Their introduction was by chance. Somewhere somebody used, and I used to give the example of nitrogen mustard, how it was put in the use in the Second World War, and the lymphoid system used to disappear in the animals, and that's how they started using in the lymphoma. So that was just by observation. While here today, after the discovery of the gene defect, gene mutation, overexpression, it came up that now we can make the drugs and according to our need, and then the whole thing. And I remember the discussion used to be tyrosine kinase. See, the tyrosine kinase is present all over the body. There, for us that time, tyrosine kinase was a single enzyme. I see. How can it differentiate tyrosine kinase inhibitor? And then slowly we realized, nay, that you can make sure that tyrosine kinase also is specific for a specific. I think these were all, we used to listen to the lecture and become more wiser after that. So listening to those lectures was a great fun.
So, in the future, I know in the same context, what do you see is the role of next generation sequencing, biomarkers, and the very advanced approaches with RNA studies or proteomics, and what do you see them doing for non-small cell lung cancer?
I think these things have to develop. They are developing. Technology is improving. The results are coming very fast, and therefore, newer and newer information will give us an better therapeutic approaches. Maybe in future we'll be using the multiple drugs together, and or maybe a single drug working at multiple targets. So all these things will come up, and I'm sure we will be more successful in this area.
So, immune checkpoint inhibitors have arrived and have changed the landscape of non-small cell lung cancer treatment. The Checkmate 057 and the Keynote 010 established the role of nivolumab and pembrolizumab in 2015-16. So, how did you see the arrival of immunotherapies in non-small cell lung cancer?
Yeah, I think uh, we were interested in immunotherapy long before. I remember the malignant melanoma. All my patients of malignant melanoma, we used to give them BCG, and occasionally we'll see the disappearance of one particular area, and we used to be excited about that. And then we did use BCG in many other condition also as an experimenter, but nothing worked till the information about biology of the immune system came in, and then the recognition of the PDL1, PD1, and I think it has been a dramatic change that has happened after that. That today, by giving the or manipulating the immune system, we are able to make the T cells to destroy the tumor cells, and that I think was beyond imagination. I must say that we never expected such type of the phenomenal targeted immunotherapy.
So, now a lot of work is being done in locally advanced non-small cell lung cancer with immunotherapies. So I can ask you, what do you foresee for these therapies' role in early stage non-small cell lung cancer in the future? Immunotherapies.
Yeah, I think in the early stage lung cancer, it will take time before we go away from the surgery. Because surgery is such a dramatic one day job, and surgery is also becoming simpler and simpler. But I think sooner or later, there are people who will not be eligible for the surgery, and they will opt for some other. And I feel that if it is working in the advanced cases so well, I cannot imagine why it should not work in the early cases. And maybe it needs, like we know that radiotherapy combined with the immunotherapy works better. So maybe in the early stage, you can combine radiotherapy along with the immunotherapy and get the equally good result as compared to the surgery. So I think obviously we are looking forward for using the immunotherapy in combination with other modalities of the treatment. Uh, like what has happened now, we are using the uh, targeted therapy. That means one of these tyrosine kinase inhibitor with the chemotherapy, and also the tyrosine kinase inhibitors with the immunotherapy. All these combinations will come up, and the things will become probably much easier, and results may also improve.
Sir, you are one of the most respected medical oncologists in the country. Patients come to see you after multiple opinions, and sometimes that can be a dilemma. How do you counsel these patients when they come to see you for a second, third, or even a fourth opinion?
Yeah, I think it's very important. Requires a little skill, I must say that. And one of the first skill that has given me this chance of counseling the patient is the smile. I can tell you that. The moment patient enters, he looks at me and he says, "Fine, my half of my disease is gone because I am seeing you." Many patients come and tell me that. and I don't see any other thing except the smile. And some patients have also told me that they have gone to many doctors, not only me, but they go everywhere. He says, everybody, when they go through my papers and look at me, they think that something has fallen for them. They make such a serious face that I get afraid. And it's only when I saw you that I am not afraid now. So it has changed. So that it's a thinking process also at that condition. Second thing is, of course, I think it's very important to be to show and keep some hope. I think it's important. We cannot be inhuman. I think it's inhuman to tell somebody that look, go home, and but you can always tell them, fine, you go home, eat well, become strong. Let us see, we may have some new discovery for you. So you see, you are giving them a 1% hope. Patient lives on the 1% hope also. So I think you have to really never take away the hope from the patients. So I have realized that by talking, of course, I mean, I'm not saying that you have to give them also. Suppose a patient is really good for some treatment, give him the treatment, of course. But suppose you have to tell them that we have no treatment, you have received all the best of the treatment, and now there's nothing. That also can be conveyed very, very gently and in a positive note. I call it positive note. Some people feel that that's not correct. You should tell them openly that this is we have nothing. You go home, and they even give them the time. I say, how are you giving the time to anybody? Never give the time to somebody. Give them 3 weeks. You have 3 weeks to live. Go home. You have 6 weeks to live. You have 6 months to live. Live. I think it's ridiculous. I even if the patient insists, knowing how much I'm going to live, I always sort of manage in a way that I can't give them the time period. Because then they are looking at that time, they are wasting their life even today. So that's the thing. So I think all of us have to realize in oncology, particularly in oncology, where you give the time based on what? On what basis we give the time? On averages. We give on the average. Average never applies to the individual. So I hate to give this time period to somebody. So if you keep these few things in mind, I think you will do a good sort of service to the humanity, particularly patients who are suffering from it, so that in the last sort of period of their life, they can have some hope and go on.
Very
And I
wise.
have done this. I have done this even in the patients who are in ICU. They know that tomorrow something is going to happen, but I tell them, no, no, you are fine. I think we are giving you the treatment, whatever you are giving. You may be giving tablets, and maybe let us see how it happens. Build up. So I think these are few words which you use. I mean, obviously, I'm not hiding anything from the patient. Relatives, when they come and ask us, we tell them. But again, I don't tell them time. I tell them, yes, is that we really do not have a effective treatment. So everybody is informed. Most of the time, the patient knows, but you don't have to tell him that. I think that's the important thing to realize. Patients are not sort of unclear about it. They are very clear. When they come to us, they are very clear. They are hoping for the moon, but they come with the hope, that few percent hope, and then you take away that hope. I think that's not a good.
Nicely said, sir. Patients come to you hoping for the moon. I have seen some of your patients. They adore you. I have seen that with my own eyes. Sir, what is your advice to the medical oncologists for being professional and mutual respect among medical oncologists?
No, I think modern medical oncologists are doing a wonderful job. You must remember that. Because in my days, it was very simple. Few surgeries, few drugs, and radiotherapy, where the radiotherapist used to mark like this and send the patient down to the machine. That was the situation in oncology. Today is more precise. You have to think more. You have to learn more. You have to apply that perfectly. So it's a great job that all the young medical oncologists are doing it. And because they're during the learning process of 3 years, I think that's a big sort of experience that they get in 3 years. What we used to get in 20 years, they got it in 3 years. So as soon as they are over with 3 years, they are as good as us, and there's no difference at all. So they can really practice nicely. Few things which come by experience. I think like how to convey the diagnosis, how to discuss with the patients, and how to really make sure that the treatment is palatable for them. All these things, they come up with the experience slowly. So that requires little experience talking to them. I know some of the doctors, they don't even look at the patient. They look at the case paper and they talk, then patient is out. They don't listen to the patient. So I think that that's the little difference which comes by experience. We have to, all of us have to learn to listen to the patient. Never interrupt the patient when he's telling you his history, and listen to him and then try to give him the whatever advice. So I think it's a great job. Everybody is doing it, and I really wish them best of the luck.
Very encouraging words. Sir, I learned that you were born in Pakistan in 1947, just before the independence. And then you were denied a seat in MBBS in Grant Medical College in 1965. And then you had to fight with the dean and secured your seat. You took up medical oncology in 1974 when it was a neglected branch. You have overcome several odds in life. Sir, what is your advice to the medical oncologists when they face challenges in life?
Yeah, you see, basically, all of us have a challenge throughout their lifetime. Challenge never stops. Today, one challenge is over, the next challenge is in front of you. So that's how one has to use your own potential to overcome those challenges. I think that's the only way that we can progress in future, and that's what really happened in our some by your own effort, some maybe by luck from the Almighty. So I think we should also in our practice we should never forget the Almighty. And I always remember this line that we treat and He cures. So I think that's one thing which most of us should really remember.
Sir, this is a memorable day for me. It was a privilege to interact with you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay.